Hi, I'm Rick Schultz of Virtual Dynamics, and I'm here to talk to you about audiophile terminology. Audiophile terminology is one of the problems that we have in high-end audio right now. It's not talked about very often. In fact, I might be one of the first guys to actually really come out and publicly address this particular problem that we're having. But it's a really big problem in high-end audio, because what we're talking about is the terminology, the words that we use to describe sound. And we make up a lot of words in high-end audio, and let's be fair, we make them up. I've watched a lot of my buddies actually invent new words to try to describe sound. I've got a couple of friends that are just pros at it. They're always creating brand new words for the audiophile industry, and it'll be a buzzword that will kind of float through the industry for a while, and they get a real big smirk on their face whenever they hear their word come back around, and somebody's using it to explain their audio system. No. Audiophile terminology is actually growing. So we actually got more words today than we did a year ago, and we'll have more words a year from now than we do right now. And these words may not be very dependable. In fact, what I found is a lot of these words, a lot of this terminology that we're creating is incredibly undependable for us as audiophiles to really communicate well with each other about the thing that we're really trying to talk about, which is describing the sound of an audio system. Let me give you a little bit of an example. Warm. What does warm mean? Well, just to be on the comical side, warm is the reality of what happens when I get home about a half an hour late for supper. Warm is what my dinner would be if I wasn't there right on time. If I was there right on time, I'd have hot. And if I'm really late, sometimes you're here an extra couple hours and you're burning the midnight oil, and you get from work to home, and your fridge is now full with your supper, that you're going to pull it back out of there, and that would be considered cold. So we've got hot, warm, and cold. What are those terminologies supposed to mean when we put them into high-end audio? And we do. One real common one is warm. We don't use cold and hot nearly as much, but we use warm all the time. What does warm mean? Well, as I started to ask audiophiles, customers of mine and friends of mine, what they meant by warm, I started to realize that nobody meant the same thing. There was so many different definitions for warm as people started to explain to me what they thought warm meant, that I started to realize that warm itself didn't mean a single thing. Because if it was that, if the descriptions for what warm meant varied that amount, then it really wasn't a good guidance for us at all. For example, one of the descriptions I had when I asked one audiophile what warm meant, he thought, well, when I think of a warm system, I think of one that's approaching being a little bit too bright and fatiguing. It's not really bright as far as high frequency energy kind of ripping at you, and the tweeter energy, which will kind of rip and create that edginess in your ears, and you can just realize that the higher frequencies are becoming really dominant, and they're overemphasized and they're breaking up. That's often what we refer to as a bright sound. But again, bright doesn't mean anything either, because a guy might be able to explain bright and he might mean something completely different than that. If we are trying to use warm, we might say, well, if it's not completely bad that way as far as high-end fatigue, then it might be warm if it's just got a bit of that. Or warm might mean full-bodied, that there's a lot of boom in the system. Warm might mean that there's a lot of integration and mixing and merging of audio signals, so that warm is the sound of an audio system when the guitar seems to float endlessly into the vocals, and the two don't really become very separated, and at the lower level it kind of sounds a little bit melodic or cool. That could be warm as well. In fact, there's endless terminology for the description of this one particular word that we might all be using, and find out that we, for the most part, all mean a different thing. And that's what I found as I started to go through this, is that that's what's happening. In fact, it's happening in a really great way. When I say great, I mean bad. This is not a good problem to be having. This is a really bad problem. Why? Well, let's go in an audio form. And you go out there and say, I'd like a set of cables that are kind of warm sounding. And so some guy thinks, well, if you want warm sounding cables, I know these ones sounded, really, really fatiguing to me, and they certainly had a problem in the high end. Maybe, you think you're missing some high end definition, and so by putting a cable like this in, maybe you'll get some. So, yeah, these ones are warm. You should try them. And what he really meant by warm was, something that was more melodic in nature and more relaxing to listen to. Let's face it, it's impossible not to use some terminology that's going to be difficult for us to understand. As I sit here and I talk to you and try to use words to be able to describe sound, even though I'm trying to describe some of the problems that we have, I'm using some of our audiophile terminology because I don't know what else to use. There's nothing for us. That's why we make up these words, is because there's nothing for us in our language. There's nothing to be able to use to describe the sound of these systems properly without being able to get a little bit more descriptive and sometimes a little bit more animated. We need to really talk about what it is that we're looking for and be descriptive. So the next time you're looking through and talking with somebody, and if you really want to take a more professional approach, and I think that this is what we're ending up with, a professional approach would be to take the time to actually explain what exactly it is that we mean by this particular sound. So if we use a terminology like warm, explain it. Try to just explain a little bit more what you mean by the terminology warm. And by going through that little bit of extra effort, I think that we'll all collectively start to understand a little bit more of what our terminology actually means, and we won't be so far off track as we are right now. Because I can tell you from the people that I've talked to, the customers that have phoned in, the manufacturers that I know and the reviewers that I know, we are on incredibly different pages when we're using our audiophile terminology. All the time, maybe not every single time, but I think the majority of times. The reality is we're using different words, or we're interpreting the words that we're using differently. So one guy means one thing, another guy hears it and interprets something completely different. I'm Rick Schultz, and I think that's kind of a fun topic for high-end audiophiles to think about. Thanks.